Hey you, and welcome. In this video, we're going to work with Firebase Cloud Functions. So let's dive right into it. In order to see the value of Cloud Functions, I'm going to start building a new feature. And that feature is going to be a very simple addition to our Contact app. So right now in the Contact app on the home page, I have this blurb of paragraph that is hard-coded. We got this from Chakra templates. I want to modify it. And I want to generate a quote every time somebody tries to land on this page. They should get a new quote from our app. And I'm going to use Cloud Functions to do that. Right. So let's do that. I'll go over to the API that I want to use to make that work. And that's called the favqueues.com/API. And that's just favorite quotes. It generates a quote every time you make a request, and it will handle the randomization for us. And to make the API request, we have to call the URL that I'm highlighting right now. If I was to call this in the browser, we can see that it works, and it gives us the quote in the body right there. I live in possibility, which is great. So yeah, this is how you generate a quote. You just keep calling it again and again, and each time it's going to give you a random link. So we should be able to utilize this API into our app. Now, it is possible to call this API directly from our React app using the fetch API from JavaScript or even libraries. However, I want to use the API key to make it so that it's more secure, I'm not throttled, and also my usage is tracked so I know how many quotes are being generated. Many reasons for it. In many scenarios, you will be working with API keys on various APIs, and you want to keep them secret. You don't want them to be dealt with on the front end, because then the API key is available to anybody who sees the request go to the server. So how do we do that? Well, that's where the Cloud Functions come in handy. I'm going to make the request using the Cloud Function. So that means my app will make request to the Cloud Function, and then function will make a request to this API, and then back to the function, back to the app. Right? So that's the whole point of it. I've already signed up for the favqueues account. If you haven't done so, go right ahead and do that. And I will click on My API, which takes me to this API section, and you click on Generate API. That gives you an API key. All right, with that out of the way, let's start working on our Cloud Function. So I'll go back to my VS Code. And in our VS Code, remember, we have a functions directory, and it has index file, index.ts. If I open that, remember we had commented out the first line. We're going to uncomment that. And there is a code snippet right here. I'll copy paste that as is and uncomment. And this code snippet will tell us a little bit about what a Cloud Function looks like. Well, in the beginning, Cloud Function will be a named export. So hello world in this case is a Cloud Function that we're going to register, and is going to take functions HTTPS on request as a type. And this is a function. When you call this function, it registers a Cloud Function with Firebase, and this is a on request type. That means when you make a HTTP request, this is what should happen. And it takes a callback function as a param or an argument. And the callback function will receive a request and response object, and you can do business logic inside the function to make the request however you want. Now, I will not work with on request, I'll work with on call. And the reason for that is because I will be making requests from my app, not from the browser. And this is not for external use, it's for internal use only. And on call will also give me access to the authentication context. So let me show you how you know that. If I go back to Firefox, in the documentation for Firebase, I will go to Cloud Functions, call functions directly, call functions from app. And in this documentation, it covers the whole aspect of how to call functions from your app. And if I scroll further down, it shows me that when you make a function, which is a HTTPS on call function, instead of request and response, you receive data and context. And then data will give you access to what data the function receives when the call is being made. So you can say, give me a quote with some word in it, or give me something else with some word. So you can provide arguments in the data object. Context, however, will be passed down with the Firebase SDK, and that will tell me whether this request is made by an authenticated user or not. And I can check against it to say, I'm not going to allow any unauthenticated user to get access to my API. So it makes it more secure. And that's what we need here. So I'm going to copy paste this code here into my VS Code, delete the snippet that we looked at just before. There we are. Oh, instead of exports, it will be export const. The other snippet is from an older code base, I believe. And instead of add message, I'll call it generate quote. function HTTPS on call, data and context. Perfect, that's good. I will do some code here. So first thing would be is check if the context auth is available. If it isn't, return early, and I can just return you are not authorized. And remember, in this on-call function, we don't have to say response.status or anything like that. Just returning like a JavaScript, that should be fine, and the execution will stop. So that's a little bit easier to work with. Okay, next thing would be I have to make the request to the FabQ API. And in order to do so, I will install a NPM module called Axios. So I go to my CLI in my contact app/functions directory. If you're not there right now, you cd into my functions directory and do npm install Axios, like so. That should install Axios package for us. That's going to allow us to make a request. And once that is installed, I'll go back to my code and import Axios from Axios like so. All right, and let's go down here to line 15, Axios get request. This is a get request. I will pass in the URL. I'll go back to Firefox, get the URL from the documentation, copy that over, paste, and then I will pass in the API key as well. And in order to do so, let's go back to the documentation for the API and check the authorization section. That's where it will tell us how do we pass the API key in. And in this case, it says in the header, we can pass in the authorization and the key will just be a string value. And that's what we'll do. So let's copy over our key, the API key. Now I'll go over to VS Code and let's start writing a new object. So in Axios.get, first argument is going to be the URL that you're calling. And the second argument is going to be an object that can have many different options to it. One of them would be headers. Headers is an object as well. And inside this object, I can say authorization will be a string value, and that will be the string value. I'll hard-coded that for now. All right. That's good. Next, let's just return this as is, or no, and instead of returning it, let's assign it to a const result and await this. And we have to make our callback function async to make the await work. So let's do that really quickly. Perfect. With that done, let's return the result.data, and result.data would have a quote.body. And you would wonder, how do I know this? Well, if I go back to the request that I had made with FabQs, you can see that when the request was returned back to me, at the top there is a quote key. So that's .quote right there. And .body inside the quote is where the quote is. So by default, if I go back to my VS Code, I can see that result.data is this Axios API. When it gets something back, it will return us the status code along with data. So I go into result, then data, then quote, then body. All right. I'll put question marks just in case any of these are undefined. I don't want my function to error out for me, and save it. Great. Now I'm ready to push the code. I'll start working with Firebase deploy in the CLI. So in the CLI, Firebase deploy, this will deploy our website and also deploy the functions. I'll make this bigger. And just as expected, there's tons of error messages, and they're all coming from our ESLint, I believe. Yes, right there. So I'll make a small modification and see if that fixes my problem here. I'll go to package.json for functions, and right where it says lint, I will put a space at the end, -- fix. So that should automatically try and fix my code for me. I'll close out the package.json. Let's run Firebase deploy one more time. Let's see what happens. That did the trick. So fix -- fix at the end of ESLint seemed to have worked, and now I have my function deployed. Let's go to Firebase console and see how it looks when it's deployed. So let's go over to Firefox here, and in our functions section, I open that from the sidebar, build, and functions right there. Yep, and I will refresh my page to see how the function looks. There we are. Generate quote is there. It gives me the name of the function along with the URL. And if I try to go to this URL right now, notice what happens. It gives me an invalid argument. That means it's a bad request. You're not allowed to access this endpoint. That means it's only available through the app and only when you're authorized through our Firebase, which is super secure and it's good to use. All right. So let's go ahead and make the request. I'll go back to the documentation for Firebase. And let's go further down. Or actually, I'll go all the way to the top. There's a section called call the function, and that's the one we need. And what we need to do here is destructure get functions and HTTPS callable. Get functions is going to give us the module that's going to allow us to work with the Firebase functions on the front end. And using functions, I'll pass that to HTTPS callable like so, and then pass it the message, or sorry, the name of your function, which is generate quote in our case, and assign that to a new variable that's going to be a function. Is going to return us a new function, and then we call that is going to be a promise. We can pass it params. In this case, in our case, we don't provide it any params because we're not expecting anything. It just gives us a quote, and we will await that, and the result will have the information for us in result.data. All right, so let's see if we can make that work. I'll copy over the get functions and go over to our VS Code in firebase.ts. That's where all my modules for Firebase are. Export const functions equals to get functions. Try to auto import. That didn't work. Let's go import it ourselves from, didn't do it properly. From Firebase functions. And there we are. Destructure out get functions. Perfect, that should do it. And now let's go to the component that needs to call the endpoint, and that's the hero.tsx. In here, that's where the monetize your content wording is coming from. So I need to replace this with a quote. So first things first, let's start in new state. Use state. Import that from React. By default, it will be an empty string. And that would be a quote, set quote. And the quote itself will replace the monetize your content wording, JSX, JavaScript, and then there we are, save it. Perfect. So that's first things first, is the quote is now in the state. Now let's populate the state by using cloud functions. So I'll use effect to make it so that on mount the call happens, using it an empty array for only on mount, and handle call, which is a new function I'm gonna make right now. Const handle call, empty function. Let's make it an async function. There we are. And we will await the requests here. All right. So first things first, I think I have to import a few things. I will import from Firebase functions, HTTPS callable, and from our utils Firebase, I will import functions. And here I will assign the function to generate quote variable, call the HTTPS callable, pass it the functions module from our utils, and the name of our function, which is the same generate quote right there. Great. And let's now make the request, await that request, pass it no params, no arguments, just a simple function call. And when the result variable is available to us, it will give us the data, which will be the actual quote. I'm going to call set quote like so and assign that. It is complaining, I think is because it may be null at some point, or the data type is undefined, or we don't know what the return would be. So I could do as any to cast it, or if I really want to type it, I can go to HTTPS callable, diamond brackets, provided this string. I think that should do it. No, we have to do string again. So it's two types. Perfect. All right, so that should do it. And there we go. We're getting the quote on the right-hand side. And if I refresh again, the quote is different. Great. With that working, I'll see you all in the next video.